with you today. The topic of my talk this morning is the title is the role of government in a free society. Now, in the course of my comments, I'm going to say many things that will break with conventional wisdom on a whole range of topics. I'm going to say some things that may seem insensitive, politically incorrect, mean and uncaring. To the extent that any one of those things are true, I urge you to ask any kind of question that you want during the question and answer period. You need not feel as though you owe me any undue courtesy because I'm your guest. Raise hard questions. You need not worry about insulting me. I am uninsultable. The only way you could possibly insult me is to suggest that I'm not pretty good in basketball. And that's a matter of ethnic pride that I take seriously. But the point this morning is to challenge conventional wisdom on a whole range of topics and to make the argument for personal liberty. Now, let me begin by saying that the justification for the growth of government in our society far beyond what the founders of this great nation envisioned for us. The justification is to promote fairness and justice. That's a worthy goal, but we might also ask, what is fairness and justice? We might also ask, what is the legitimate role of government in a free society? Let me spend just a few minutes discussing what the founders saw as the legitimate role of government. And let's do that by turning to the rule book that they provided us, namely the United States Constitution. Most of what the founders saw as the legitimate role of the federal government in our society is found in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. And let me just briefly quote some sections thereof. Included in what Congress is authorized to do by the United States Constitution, it says that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Congress is also authorized to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. They have the power to coin money, to establish post offices and post roads, to raise and support armies. The framers granted Congress taxing and spending powers for a few other activities. Namely, if you look at Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, the Congress of the United States is authorized to do 19 different things. Now, nowhere in the Constitution do we find authority for Congress to tax and spend for up to 3/4 of what Congress taxes and spends for today. In other words, there's no constitutional authority for farm subsidies, bank bailouts, food stamps, not to mention midnight football or midnight basketball. There's no authority for Congress to spend money on education. Matter of fact, the word education does not appear in the United States Constitution. So I think that we can safely say that we have made a significant departure from the constitutional principles of individual freedom and limited government that made us a rich nation in the first place. These principles of freedom were embodied in our nation through the combined institutions of private property and free enterprise. Now, I know some people they'll say, well, Williams, that's a very narrow interpretation of the United States Constitution. The Constitution is a living document. Now, whenever anybody tells you that the Constitution of the United States is a living document, that is the same as saying we don't have a Constitution. I mean, for example, how many of you would like to play me poker and the rules be living? That is, maybe my two pair can beat your full house once in a while. That is, the only way that rules make sense is that if the rules are fixed. Now, the framers of the Constitution also gave us a mechanism for altering those rules, namely Article 5 of the United States Constitution. Now, through numerous successful attacks, private property and free enterprise that the framers envisioned are mere skeletons of their past. And Thomas Jefferson anticipated this when he said, "The natural progress of things is for government to gain ground and for liberty to yield." The best way to look at this process of government gaining ground and liberty yielding in our country is to look at what has happened to taxation and spending. There's only one way to look at taxes. Taxes represent government claims on private property. And indeed, if government were to tax private property at 100%, it would confiscate private property. And taxes are going up. But even a better measure of what government does is to look at what has happened to spending in our country. Let's go back to the turn of the century. In 1902, expenditures at all levels of government, federal, state, and local levels of government, totaled $1.7 billion. In that year, the average taxpayer paid $60 in federal, state, and local taxes. In fact, from 1787 until 1920, federal expenditures were only 3% of the GNP compared to 27% of the GNP today, including the underground government. And that was except during wartime. Expenditures were more than 3% of the GNP during that interval. Today, federal expenditures alone are over $1.5 trillion. Actually, $1.7 trillion. State and local governments spend over $1 trillion. The average taxpayer pays around $9,000 a year in federal, state, and local taxes. Now, what's the significance of all this? Well, it means that as time goes by, you and I own less and less of our most valuable property, namely ourselves and the fruits of our labor. Another way of looking at this is the average taxpayer works from January 1st until May 8th to pay federal, state, and local taxes. Now, of course, what that means is that we're working going on 5 months out of the year, and we do not have rights to decide how the fruits of our labor will be used. Somebody else makes that decision. Now, keep in mind, a working definition of slavery is that you work all year, and it is someone else who decides how the fruit of your labor will be used. Now, in the economic sphere, The founders thought that relatively free markets, or what is called capitalism, was the most effective social organization for the promotion of individual freedom. Indeed, capitalism is defined as a system wherein individuals are free to pursue their own interests so long as they do not violate the property rights of others. Under a system of capitalism, or some people call it free enterprise, there is voluntary exchange. There are private property rights held in goods and services. Much of the original intent of the United States Constitution, as seen in the document itself and the Federalist Papers that debated the Constitution, was to bring about a climate in which this kind of social organization could occur. Now, the great benefit of the free enterprise system is that through private ownership and control over property, it minimizes the capacity of one person to coerce another person. Additionally, the coercive powers of the state are minimized. And we might ask, what are the legitimate functions of government or the state in a free society? Well, one legitimate function is to protect you and I from international thugs violating our private property rights. So that says that one legitimate function of government in a free society is to provide for national defense. Another legitimate function of government in a free society is to protect you and I from domestic thugs violating our private property. So that says that at some level of government, it is a legitimate function to provide for police services. Other legitimate functions of government in a free society are those of enforcing constitutional order, adjudicating disputes, and the provision of certain public goods as an economist would define them. In order to pay for these legitimate and constitutionally mandated functions of government, each citizen should pay a share. Now, for the last half-century, free enterprise and what it implies has been under unrelenting attack in our country. Americans from all walks of life, and I stress all walks of life, whether they realize it or not, have demonstrated a deep and abiding contempt for private property rights and individual liberty. Free enterprise is threatened today in our country, somewhat ironically, not because of its failure, but is threatened because of its success. That is, capitalism has been so successful in eliminating the traditional problems of mankind, such as disease, pestilence, gross hunger, and poverty, that all other human problems appear to us to be at once inexcusable and unbearable. The desire by many Americans to eliminate these so-called unbearable and inexcusable problems has led us away from the basic ideals and principles upon which our prosperous nation was built. In the name of other ideals, such as equality of income, sex and race balance, affordable housing, medical care, orderly markets, consumer protection, energy conservation, just to name a few, we have abandoned many personal freedoms. As a result of widespread control by government in an effort to achieve these so-called higher objectives, we are increasingly being subordinated to a point where considerations of personal freedom are but secondary or tertiary matters. they're treated as dirt. Let me give you an example of that. Suppose I write a letter to the United States Congress. I say, my name is Walter Williams. I am an emancipated adult. I am fully capable of taking care of my own retirement needs. If I fail to do so, let me depend on charity or die of starvation. But stop taking Social Security taxes out of my paycheck. How do you think that would be greeted? It'd be greeted with contempt. That is, here I am, an emancipated adult, and the Congress of the United States is going to force me to set aside part of my earnings for retirement. That's the kind of contempt that there is for individual liberty. Now, the ultimate end to this process is totalitarianism, which is nothing more than a reduced form of servitude. Now, let me make this clear. I am not saying that we are a totalitarian nation yet. But if you ask the question, which way are we headed? Tiny steps at a time. Are we headed towards more liberty or towards more control? It would have to unambiguously be towards more control. And remember, if you take tiny steps towards any goal, sooner or later you're going to reach it. Or as the great philosopher David Hume said, it is seldom that liberty of any kind is lost all at once. It's always lost bit by bit. Or put a better way by my late colleague Leonard Read, who was the founder of economic education in New York. He said that if you want to take liberty away from Americans, you had to know how to cook a frog. Leonard Read said, you cannot cook a frog by putting on a pot of boiling water and then throwing the frog in the water. Why? Because the frog's reflexes are so quick, as soon as his feet touch the boiling water, he would hop away and be free. Leonard Read said that the way to cook a frog is to put on a pot of cold water, put the frog in the water, and heat it up bit by bit. And by the time the frog realized he was being cooked, it was too late. That's the same thing with Americans. If anybody came over here talking about taking away all of our liberties all at once, we would righteously rebel. But they can talk about taking away our liberties bit by bit. The primary justification for the attack on private property, individual freedom, can be found in people's desire for government to do good. We all say things like, government should care for the poor, government should help the disadvantaged, government should help the elderly, government should help failing businesses, government should help college students and other deserving segments of our society. Well, that's all well and good to say that. But we must recognize that government has no resources of its very own. Now, what I mean by that, when I say government has no resources of its very own, that means that those programs coming out of Washington or out of your state capital, they don't represent congressmen and senators reaching in their own pockets and sending out the money. Moreover, there's no tooth fairy or Santa Claus giving them the money. Now, when you recognize that government has no resources of its very own, that forces you to recognize that the only way the government can give one American citizen $1 is to first, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscate that dollar from some other American. Now, some of you might say, well, what's this guy mean by intimidation, threats, and coercion? Well, you have April 15th next year to check me out on that. You can tell the agents of the United States Congress, I don't want my earnings going to bail out some banks. to go for some farmers or to go to some poor people, you will see all the intimidation, threats, and coercion that you want to see. And if you act too resolute in keeping what is rightfully yours, you will get killed by the agents of the United States Congress. Now you say, well, what does this guy Williams mean by that in America? Well, trace up the following scenario. I send Congress a letter. The agents of Congress, namely the IRS, I say, I will pay my share of those constitutionally mandated functions of government. But I will not give up any of my income to bail out farmers, to bail out poor people, to send college students, to send students to college. I refuse to do that. And what do you think they'll do? They'll say, Williams, we're going to fine you. I'll say, I'm not going to pay the fine. They say, Williams, we're going to take your house. I say, no, you're not going to take my house. They send their agents armed to take my house. And I will be in the window, armed, protecting my house. And I'll get killed by the agents of the United States Congress. That's what I mean by intimidation, threats, and coercion. In other words, we American people, we support government doing things that if a private person did the identical thing, we would all roundly condemn him as a low-down, despicable thief. For example, it might be the dead of winter. I might see an elderly lady sleeping on a grate in downtown New York. She's hungry, she needs some medical attention, she needs some shelter. I could walk up to Professor Chambliss with a gun in my hand. And I could say, give me your $200. Then, having gotten this $200, I can go and buy the lady some housing for the evening, get her some medical attention, and some food. Would you find me guilty of a crime? Of course I would be guilty of a crime. I'd be guilty of theft, regardless of what I did with the money. Now, most Americans can agree with that. But here's the stumbling block. Is there a conceptual distinction between that act and when the agents of the United States Congress come up to me and say, Williams, you know that $200 you made last week that you planned to buy 2 nice bottles of Lafite Rothschild Bordeaux wine? You will not do that with it. You will give it to us. And we will go downtown and help the lady out. I assert that there is no conceptual distinction between those two acts. Both of them constitute theft. That is, taking the rightful property of one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong. Now, if you press me for a distinction, I can only find one, and it ought to be trivial to moral people. That is, the first act, where I walked up to Professor Chambliss, that is illegal theft. The second act is legal theft, but theft nonetheless. Now, you might say, well, Williams, is legal, but for moral people, legality alone cannot be our talisman. Because there are many things in this world that were or are legal, but clearly immoral. That is, slavery was legal. Did I make it moral? Apartheid in South Africa was legal. Nazi persecution of the Jews, Stalinist purges, they were all legal. Did that make it moral? So the moral question that we have to ask in this particular case is there a moral basis for taking what belongs to one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong? In my 63 years of life, I have not found a case for that. Now, a lot of people say, well, look, Williams, we are a democracy. And majority rules. I mean, all these things you rail about, they represent majority rules. Well, I don't think that a majority consensus establishes morality. In a moral society, we want most, if not all, of our relationships to be voluntary and minimize involuntary relationships. Or maybe another way to put it, a better way to put it, is, or I tell people that I love, instead of using the word voluntary, I love seduction. I like any kind of seduction, but I'm against rape. Any kind of rape. Now, what's the essence of seduction? Seduction occurs when we proposition our fellow man in the following fashion. We say to him, if you make me feel good, I'll make you feel good. That's the essence of seduction. And for those of you who remember your game theory, it's a positive sum game. That is, both parties benefit. Let me give you an example of it. Seduction abounds. I walk into my grocer with $2 in my hand. And I proposition him. I say, if you make me feel good, give me that gallon of milk. I'll make you feel good, give you $2. He is better off, and I'm better off, because I'm better off because I value the milk more than the $2, and he's better off because he valued the $2 more than the milk. Now, rape, on the other hand, is when we proposition our fellow man in the following fashion. We say to him, if you don't make me feel good, I'm going to make you feel bad. That's a zero-sum game. And the example of that would be where I walked into the grocer with a gun in my hand. And I say to him, if you don't make me feel good, give me the milk. I'm going to make you feel bad, blow your brains out. Clearly I benefit, but he's worse off. Now, going back to something I said a little earlier, a lot of people say, well, this is democracy, it's majority rule. Well, first I try to tell the people that the framers did not intend for it to be a democracy, they meant a republic. But more important than that, I don't think gang rape is any better than individualized rape. Just because you vote to rape somebody doesn't make it right. A majority consensus does not establish morality. Now, widespread private control and ownership of property is consistent with seduction and the minimization of rape. Widespread government ownership and or control is consistent with rape maximization. Government all around the world is the major source of organized rape. Because in essence, our relationship with government is, if we don't make them feel good, they're going to make us feel bad. An example of this was back in 1959. I drove a taxi cab in Philadelphia. And I was earning about $400 a month, which was good money back in 1959. And the reason I was earning that good money is because I was serving my fellow man very well. That is, if you got into my taxi, I could direct you to where you could buy anything you wanted any time of the day. And I was handsomely rewarded for this. Anyway, I got this letter. And in essence, the letter said, Williams, you will stop making $400 a month and start making $68 a month. And normally people don't switch voluntarily in that direction. And I was being told that if I don't make the government feel good by being in their army, they're going to make me feel bad by putting me in jail. Now, there's a lot of nonsense being taught in colleges, and we hear it on news media, that says, well, we need big government, we need a big and strong government to offset the power of big business. Well, despite the alleged power of industrial giants like IBM, AT&T, Chrysler, Exxon, what kind of power do they have over you and I in a free society? I mean, in order for Exxon to get $1 out of me, what must happen first? Well, I must voluntarily get out of my chair, voluntarily drive up to this man's lot, and voluntarily hand him $1. What kind of power does he have over me? That does not describe my relationship with government. Government can get dollars from me whether I want to give it to them or not, and even including over my dead body. Now, big business can get dollars from us, whether we want to give it to them or not, but what must they do first? They must first go to Washington, D.C., and get permission from the United States Congress to rip us off. For example, take Chrysler. Back during the 70s, Lee Iacocca was having a little trouble with his company. Or take the farmers right now. The farmers are having problems. The farmers know where I live. I live in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Now, if the farmer's having trouble, they can come knock on my door and say, "Buddy, can you spare a dime?" I would probably tell the farmers to go play in the traffic. And they know that. So instead of coming knocking on my door to ask me to help them out, they'll go to Senator Dole and say, "Senator Dole, if we ask Williams to voluntarily help us out, he's going to tell us to go play in traffic. Could you use your agents at the IRS to take his money to help us out?" That's how big business can get dollars from us, whether we want to give it to them or not. They must first get permission from our elected representatives. Now, the free market and voluntary exchange are roundly denounced by today's defenders of what I call the new human rights. These defenders are the chief supporters of reduced private property rights, reduced rights to profits. They are anti-competition and pro-monopoly. These are people in our country who believe that they have more intelligence and superior wisdom to the masses. And they believe that they have been ordained to forcibly impose that wisdom on the rest of us. Now, of course, they have what they consider to be good reasons for restricting the liberties of others. But I'm here to tell you that every tyrant that has ever existed on earth has had what the tyrant believed to be good reasons for restricting the freedoms of others. These people's plan requires the elimination of the market or the attenuation of the market. Now, why do tyrants not like the market? Well, because the free market implies voluntary exchange. And tyrants do not trust that people behaving voluntarily will do what the tyrant thinks they ought to do. So they want to replace the market with economic planning or industrial planning, as we've heard in some of our past elections. I'll give you a definition of economic planning that will last you the rest of your college careers. Economic planning is nothing more than the forcible superseding of somebody else's plan by the powerful elite. It's the forcible superseding of somebody else's plan by the powerful elite. For example, I might plan to buy a Honda motorcycle from a Japanese producer. The powerful elite will say, "Williams, we're going to supersede your plan through tariffs and quotas because we think you ought to buy a Harley Davidson made in America." Or my daughter might plan to work for the hardware store guy down the street for $3 an hour. He says it's okay. She says it's okay. Her mother says it's okay. I say it's okay. But the powerful elite will say, "We're going to supersede that plan. We're going to cancel that plan because it's not being transacted at prices that we think it ought to be transacted at, namely $5.15 an hour." Now, many people pursue this agenda in the name of good. But do-gooders fail to realize that most good done in the world is not done in the name of good. In other words, if you were to ask me, "Williams, what's that human motivation that gets wonderful things done?" I would say greed. Now, a lot of people say, "Well, Williams, you know, since you were trying to win friends and influence people, can't you find another word? Can't you say enlightened self-interest?" I like greed because it's more descriptive. I'm not talking about ripping off people, cheating people. I'm talking about people not giving a hoot about anybody else but themselves. They're trying to get more for themselves. That's the motivation that gets good things done. Let me give you an example of this. Last winter, we had Texas cattle ranchers getting up in the middle of the night, running down stray cows, trying to feed them, protect them from the snow, making this huge personal sacrifice so in order that New Yorkers would have beef on their shelves. You have Idaho potato farmers out there this summer picking potatoes, bugs biting them, dirt underneath their fingernails, sun beating down on their necks, just to make sure the New Yorkers also have potatoes. Now, why do you think they're doing that? Do you think they do it because they love New Yorkers? They may hate New Yorkers. I'm not that wild about New Yorkers myself. But they make sure that beef and potatoes gets to New York every single day. Why? Because they're promoting their own self-interest. They care about themselves. Now ask yourselves, how much beef and potatoes do you think New Yorkers would have if it all depended on human love and kindness? I'd be worried. Or most of you probably own automobiles. Now why do you think you have that automobile? Do you think it's because some Detroit assembly line workers cared about you? They don't give a damn about you. But you have that car because they care about themselves. And that's what Adam Smith was pointing out, that the social good is promoted best by the private interest. Most things get done because of self-interest and private property rights. Let me give you another example of this. You know, back in the 70s, during the energy crisis, and I might also add the United States government sponsored the energy crisis, they used to have these public service announcements. And it would show some bratty kid on television whining, saying, "Don't be fuelish. Save some energy for future generations." Every time I saw that advertisement, I felt like throwing my ashtray in the TV at the kid. And people have asked me, "Well, Williams, don't you care about future generations?" And I say, "No, I don't care about future generations." And they say, "Why?" I say, "What have future generations ever done for me?" I mean, what has some kid that's going to be born in 2050, what has he done for me? And if he has not done anything for me, how then am I obliged to do anything for him? But however, if you watch my actual behavior, my behavior would belie that sentiment. I live in Valley Forge, as I said, in about 3 acres of ground. And several years ago, maybe about 10 years ago, I took $400 that I could have purchased 3 nice bottles of Chateau D'Yquem Sauternes wine and consumed all by myself. Nobody else would have benefited from it. But instead, I took that money and bought some seedlings. Now, by the time those trees reach their maturity, I'll be dead. There'll be some 20, 50 kids swinging in my trees and eating my apples and pears. My wife has made extensive improvements on our house. And there'll be some 20, 50 kids tracking mud into my sunroom. Now, what's at least some of the reason I made those sacrifices of current consumption to produce some good that's going to benefit some 20, 50 kids? The answer is very easy. The nicer my house is, the longer it will provide housing services, what? The higher the price I get for it when I go to sell it. That is, by pursuing my own narrow selfish interests, I can't help but make a house available for a future generation, whether I mean to or not. Now ask yourselves, would I make those same sacrifices if the government owned my house? Would I take care of it as well? What if there were a 75% transfer tax when I went to sell my house? I wouldn't take care of his work. Anything that weakens my private property right in that house weakens my incentive to do the socially responsible thing, namely conserve one of the scarce resources of our society. Let me give you another example of private property rights. You people look like nice people. I don't know whether you're nice or not. But you might be concerned about the extinction of various species of animals. Myself, I don't care. Doesn't make any difference. And the reason is a practical one. According to biologists, 93% of everything that has ever lived on Earth is now extinct. And so I say, why quibble about 93.2, 0.3, whatever. But some of you are concerned with the extinction of the elephant, the bald eagle. You know, I was 35 years before I saw my first bald eagle. And I was looking at the critter in the cage. And I was asking myself, could I have gone another 35 years without seeing him? I concluded yes. But different people have different values, and I can appreciate that. But anyway, the point of this is that I was listening to NPR radio one night some years ago, and people were picketing the UN. They were picketing the African nations because they were concerned about the extinction and the hunting of rhinos, and they were worried about the elephant. People form Ducks Unlimited clubs, Save the Whale clubs, things like this. Anyway, I wrote down this list of animals for which people are very concerned about, marching, and I wrote down another list of animals that are very valuable to us as well. I was asking myself, how come people not marching for the chicken? How come they're not forming pig clubs? Concerned about the cow. And I say, well, what's the difference between these two lists of animals? Well, with this list of animals, cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens, they belong to somebody. Somebody's personal private wealth is at stake. And they have deep incentives to care for these animals. With this list of animals, whales and elephants, nobody owns them. They don't belong to anybody. Nobody's personal wealth is at stake. And by the way, if you go to Africa, you'll see in places like Uganda, I believe it's Uganda, where there's private ownership of elephants, and the elephants are thriving. And in, I believe it's Kenya, there's public ownership, and the elephants are disappearing. So if you're concerned about elephants or various animals, you should try to privatize them. I just can't resist this example. I haven't fully matured, according to my wife. And you know, at traffic lights, I like to sit in my car, and when the light's on red, and spin the wheels, you know, have smoke coming out of the car and making a lot of noise, and ready for the lights turning green to shoot off, like I'm in the Indy 500. But I have a Lexus 400, and I don't do that in the car. I always do it in a rental car. And that's another virtue of private property. It forces people to use the grown-up language of economics, to internalize externalities. That is, forces people to take into account the current use of property on its future value. Now, despite the virtues of the free market, and never mind, it was with the rise of capitalism that brought better treatment to racial minorities, better treatment to women, better treatment of the handicapped, better treatment to the criminals. There's considerable hostility towards the market. You know, I was giving this lecture at one university, and a lady stood up and said, the capitalism of the Western capitalism is oppressive to women. And I asked her, I said, if you are a radical feminist, what country do you want to live in? Saudi Arabia or China? You want to live in the United States. If you are a criminal, where do you want to go to jail? Turkey or Mexico? You want to go to jail in the United States so you don't miss your HBO in the afternoon. Now, the reason why the rise of capitalism brought about a humanizing influence was because capitalism made it profitable to become wealthy, not by plundering and enslaving and looting your fellow man, but by serving your fellow man, by pleasing your fellow man. That is, why is Bill Gates so rich? It's not because he robbed anybody. It's because millions of people like me reached in our pockets and gave $300 for his windows. We voluntarily gave up money to him. But despite these virtues of the free market and the fact that it's produced unprecedented wealth for the common man, there's considerable hostility towards it. Almost every group in the nation has come to feel that government owes them a special privilege. And I might add that conservatives, people who call themselves conservatives, are by no means exempt from seeking special privileges. Manufacturers feel that the government owes them protective tariffs, that is, to keep foreign goods out so they can charge you and I higher prices. Farmers feel the government owes them crop subsidies, that is, take money from one American and give it to them. Organized labor thinks that government should keep their jobs protected from having to compete with those people who are not union members. Intellectuals, college professors, feel that government should give them funds for research. College professors love to do research. Get $400,000 and $500,000 grants to do studies on poverty, and have meetings in Miami at a nice hotel during the winter to talk about poor people. If you ever see conservatives arguing, I can tell you how to bring instant peace among them. As conservatives rail against food stamps, they rail against aid to families with dependent children, they rail against legal aid, but they come out in support for aid to dependent farmers, aid to dependent banks, aid to dependent motorcycle companies. Conservatives as well as liberals, Democrats as well as Republicans, prove H.L. Mencken's definition of an election quite correct. For those of you who have forgotten, H.L. Mencken was a political satirist of the Baltimore Sun. And somebody asked H.L. Mencken to give a definition of an election. And H.L. Mencken replied, "Government is a broker in pillage. And every election is an advanced auction on the sale of stolen goods." To the extent that H.L. Mencken is correct, we have identified our national problem. That is, many of us want to blame politicians for our problems. And yes, we can blame them a tiny bit. But ladies and gentlemen, the bulk of the blame lies with you and I, because politicians are doing precisely what we elect them to office to do. And what do we elect them to office to do? We elect them to office to use the power of their office to take what belongs to one American and bring it back to us, to engage in legalized theft. And you say, well, not we Floridians, we don't do that. Well, imagine I'm running for the Senate in Florida. And during my campaign, I say, look, I read the Constitution of the United States. If you elect me to the Senate, don't count on me bringing back aid to higher education money. Don't count on me bringing Meals on Wheels, highway construction funds. Do you think I would get elected to the Senate from Florida? No, I wouldn't. Because I would not be doing what the Floridians wanted me to do. Now, the tragedy of this is that the Floridians would be absolutely right not electing me to office, because of what we might call the tragedy of the commons. That is, if I don't bring back, as a senator, if I don't bring back goodies, billions of dollars worth of goodies to Floridians, it doesn't mean that Floridians will pay a lower federal income tax. All that it means is that South Carolina will get the money instead. That is, once legalized theft begins, it pays for everybody to get involved. Those people who don't get involved, they're going to be wind up holding the brown end of the stick. Let me conclude by saying that I know you have probably a lot of questions. The big problem, one of the big problems in our country, is that the Constitution of our country provides no guarantee for our economic liberty. There's no hard and set rule on how much Congress can take from us by force. That is, if you look at the 10 amendments to the Constitution, they are fairly effective in protecting our religious freedom, our freedom of speech. But there's no similar protection on our pocketbooks. And if you read the Constitution of the United States, and I urge you to do so, I believe you'll find that it's a very negative document. Look at the language. And it shows that the framers did not trust the Congress of the United States. Look at the language. It says, Congress shall not infringe. Congress shall not inhibit. Congress shall not disparage. In other words, when you die, and if at your next destination you see anything like the Bill of Rights, you know that you're in hell. Because a Bill of Rights in heaven would be an affront to God. Congress, the framers did not trust Congress, and for a very good reason, because they knew that government is the essential source of evil in the world. So, I think we have to find some way of reining in the Congress of the United States. Maybe we need to have a spending limitation that is set a certain amount of money that Congress can spend. But I think that if the founders came back today, to today's America, and I think they'll be very disappointed with our choices. Our choice to accept what we see as safety in exchange for liberty. But the good thing about our country, the great thing about our country, is that we've never done the wrong thing for a long time. We've somehow always gotten our act together. And I think that we have to get back to the task of putting government back where the framers intended for it to be, while we still have the liberty to do so. Thank you very much, and if you have questions, I'll try to answer. Thank you.
We have a microphone.
Dr. Williams.
Would you hold off until some of the crowd goes a little bit? Just a second, and then come back. I know that. Yeah. Okay. Good question.
Dr. Williams, your liberal way of thinking has made you a controversial figure among many African American leaders in the community. Why is that?
Did everybody hear the question? Why don't you repeat your question? And the fellow on the sound, could you turn it up some?
Your conservative way of thinking has made you a controversial figure among many African American leaders in the community. Why is that?
Well, I think that you might call my ideas radical as opposed to conservative. I think that anybody who makes the case for personal liberty is probably a radical thinker, as has always been the case with history. And I think that my ideas on liberty are often not that welcome among white people. Matter of fact, if you ever come to Washington, you have a chance to hear me testifying in Congress, you should come because it's standing room only. And I don't believe that people come there for erudition. They come to see whether Williams will be arrested this time. But I think that liberty has always won a poor reception throughout mankind's history. And I think that, and very often, I'm disappointed that so many black Americans are caught up in what I think is a modern form of slavery. Keep in mind that the essence of slavery is forcibly using one person to serve the purposes of another. That's the essence of slavery. Now, it's the same thing when with government now, forcibly using one person, taking his money, making him work to support another person, whether it be a farmer, whether it be Boeing or Chrysler or some poor people. And I'm against slavery of any form. And I just wish that more Americans shared that point of view. Yes, John.
I was wondering if religion helps the overall population and the economy. Why?
Does religion help the overall population and the economy? Well, I think that the Ten Commandments are a good starting point for a moral life. I think that the Golden Rule is an excellent way to relate to our neighbor. Do unto others as you would have them do unto us. I think that religion is a very, very useful control in our society to get people to do the moral thing. And I say all this without being a religious person myself. But I do believe in many of the religious, the admonitions of Christianity.
Yeah. Nice to see you again.
All right.
In follow-up to this other student's question, I'd like to get your take on sacrilegious art. I'm sure you're familiar, and many of the students may be familiar with the debate that's going on regarding the Brooklyn Museum of Art that's displaying what many Christians regard as extremely offensive art. Should public money, should a public museum be allowed to display art that is offensive, extremely offensive, to Christians, blacks, Jews, or any other group?
Thanks. First of all, I don't believe that there should be public support of art. That is, I don't believe that money should be taken from people by force to support art. I believe in, and that's not saying that I don't believe in charity as a way to give art. But however, in the case of New York, I believe that if you're going to use public funds to support art, that by no means should it be used to support art that's offensive, such as in the case in New York, offensive to a group of people. I'm very sure that people would be very upset in our country if public funds were being used to draw the Star of David with swastikas all around it, and otherwise demean Jews, or the art was of black people in a demeaning way. There'd be a lot of people concerned with it. But it seems like to attack Christians, people who are Christians, that's kind of okay nowadays for a lot of people, and I think that's despicable. But you get out of that problem by not having public funding of art. I mean, if you spend your own money, you can draw any damn thing you want. Right? And I would be the main person fighting for that right, using private money. Yeah.
Dr. Williams, what are your views of the role of government in monopolistic competition?
Would you clarify that, sir?
How do you feel about government's intervention when they go in and regulate monopolies in our free market?
Well, I don't think government has much of a role unless they're. I would can virtually all of the antitrust legislation. Most of the monopolies you see that we have seen are a result of government, not necessarily the result of free market forces. There's always competition. There are always substitutes. Excellent example of government monopolies that are a tragedy. The U.S. Postal Services is a monopoly. That is, it is a crime for anybody else to deliver first-class mail. The public school system, the government education system in our country is a monopoly, a devastating monopoly, and has all the effects of a monopoly. But I would be very circumspect about any regulation of the market so long as fraud and misrepresentation was not used.
If not from the people, where do you propose the government get its funding?
I said in the first part of my talk that there are some legitimate functions of government that are specified in the Constitution of the United States, and people should pay their fair share for the legitimate functions of government. And I can only think of one way to do that is through taxes. And right now, the federal budget is $1.7 trillion. If the government only did what it's constitutionally mandated to do, I doubt whether the federal budget would be over $500 billion right now. So I'm not an anarchist, and I believe that we do need government to do those legitimate functions of government. And I think that each citizen should pay his share. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Williams. It's an honor. I'd first like to say mega dittos. I've enjoyed your hosting of the Great One show quite a bit. And I didn't believe your claims that you are even better looking in person than on the radio. Didn't think that was possible. I don't know if you heard Rush's interview with Patrick Buchanan last week, but I'm kind of asking you, what is young Patrick thinking? He said basically, Patrick, if you tout yourself as conservative, and the two planks of your platform are plank 1, let's keep the damn Mexicans out, and plank 2, let's save the buggy whip industry, you have left conservatism. If Patrick were to stand here and try to justify why the prescription for economic greatness for a society is to impose tariffs, what would young Patrick tell us?
Young Patrick being who?
Patrick Buchanan.
Okay. Now, I can't give you a complete answer, but I believe that when people run for high political office, they somehow see the light in some cases, and they compromise their principles. Matter of fact, I'm flattered by many Americans, very flattered when they suggest I run for high political office, but my response to them is that I will never run for high political office, because to do so would require that I rise above principle and do the right thing. And I'm not ready for such a heady trek. I'm always going to tell people things as I see them, truthfully. And I believe that Mr. Buchanan has made some compromises that I would never make. And I've known Pat Buchanan for at least 10, 15 years, and I'm quite surprised.
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Dr. Williams, do tariffs prevent domestic jobs? Or promote, domestic jobs?
Do tariffs do what?
Promote domestic jobs.
Do tariffs promote domestic jobs? Well, here's what happens. Tariffs, let's say under the Reagan administration, and I wrote about it and I was critical of the Reagan administration, they imposed so-called voluntary restraints on the importation of Japanese steel, which has the effect of a tariff. Now, the result of that was that there are more jobs created in the steel industry. Yes, employment went up in the steel industry, but employment went down in some other industries. It went down in some steel-using industries. That is, the purpose of tariffs is to keep foreign goods out so that domestic producers can charge higher prices. So that means Caterpillar, for example, who uses steel, they had to pay a higher price for steel, which made them less competitive in the domestic and international markets. And so I believe that the numbers are, and I wrote about this, and I can't really give you the numbers totally, but accurately, but the employment went up as a result of the voluntary restraints on importation of foreign steel. Employment rose in the steel industry by 35,000 jobs. In other industries, steel-using industries, employment fell by 252,000 jobs. So this is always a problem with government. That is, we have visible beneficiaries of any policy. They're visible beneficiaries of any policy, and they're invisible victims. Now, politicians love this because they can go around and say, look, that guy Williams was against my program to keep foreign steel out of the country, and he was against all these guys being employed. Look at them, they're working now. But nobody sees the invisible victims, those people who are unemployed as a result. Our companies have gone down the tubes. And I think that the voluntary restraints on foreign steel and some other restrictions on foreign steel might explain why we see, as we drive along the highways, why we see all this foreign heavy construction equipment in our country. Because it becomes cheaper. If I were a foreign competitor, let's say a Korean businessman, I would support Reagan and his efforts to keep foreign steel, this during the 80s, out of our country. The reason why is that I would get Caterpillar out of my way, and I can sell my heavy equipment in the United States. So with any government policy, there are visible beneficiaries and invisible victims. Yeah.
My name is Lisa. I wanted to, I have a question on economic growth. If the basis of this nation, part of it is by how expandable it is, how much diversity there is with sports, computers, people can do whatever. How do you expect if people in need can't ask, obviously, as you said, most people would say, no, I'm not going to help you. And if they can't ask people, and if they can't ask government, how is everyone going to grow? I think that's it.
Okay, first I should make something very clear, that I find charity a noble human motivation. I find theft a despicable one. Now, Americans are the most generous people on the face of this earth. Americans do, if you look at total world giving, Americans do 85% of all world giving. And that's always been a part of our history. Matter of fact, Alexis de Tocqueville came in the United States in the late 1830s. And he went back to France. He came here to study prisons. And he went back to France and he wrote the Democracy in America. But he was giving talks in France. He says, those Americans, I just don't understand them. Somebody becomes widowed, they have a committee. Somebody's barn burns down, they have a committee. Those Americans just love committees. Pointing out, how generous we are as a nation. Now, I definitely believe in helping people through charity, but I do not believe that we should engage in legalized theft. Now, ask this following question. These programs that we have today, they are entirely new in our history. Food stamps. For example, when poor Irish were fleeing the potato famine in the 1840s and getting here in the late 1840s, do you think when they got off the ship there was a food stamp program? There was HUD, there were WICs, Women and Infant and Children. No. For most of our history, up until, let's say, past the Second World War, we did not have all these programs. And you say, how in the world did we make it? And there's no evidence of people dying in the streets a la Calcutta and Bangladesh in the United States because they were starving to death. This is not a history of our country. To answer your question, I think we ought to depend on charity instead of government program. And then charity is a far more effective way of helping your fellow man. You know, for example, let me just ask anybody. Say you have a poor person. Say you have a person who is 16 years old. Let's say it's your daughter. She's made a mistake. She has a baby. She made a mistake and no husband. How many of us would say to her, here's $500. Come back next month, same time, same place, and you get another $500. And if you mess up more, I'll give you $600. How many of us would do this to anybody that we cared about? But that's what the welfare system does. And particularly it's been devastating to black Americans. Welfare system has done to black Americans what slavery and the cruelest discrimination could not have done. Namely, decimate the black family. Now, when charity is giving out, when there's private charity, yeah, a person helping another person would go and see whether that person was responding appropriately to the help. I mean, if you were helping, how many of us in here would help somebody, give them money, they say, look, I am not going to work, I'm just going to watch Oprah in the afternoon. We wouldn't help that person. We wouldn't help him at all. We would try to motivate him to help himself. And one of the most, and we as parents, those of you who are parents, you know that this is a difficult question. That is, we love our kids. We always want to bail them out. We want to help them. But one of the questions you must always ask when you're about to help somebody is, what is the effect of my helping this person on his own incentives to help himself? And we don't do that as a nation. When we and I think that's cruel. Thanks. Yeah.
Mr. Williams, I'd like to say first of all, if you did run for governor of Florida, I'd probably vote for you because you'd be the most honest person up there.
Oh, thank you.
My question though is, if you've made it very clear that the government is a rob Peter to pay Paul culture, is there a way that the government could, set up itself where it could be more of a legitimate government business arrangement where it could find another way to bring in money without having to forcibly take it from us in the form of tariffs and taxes? Do you have a model for that? You've shown a lot of what's wrong, but what can be done to correct it?
Well, I think what we do to correct it is go back to the constitutional government. Look, how in the world, you ask the question, how come we are uniquely the richest nation on ever existed? I think that liberty explains that. If you look around the world and you see many examples, you say, look, how come Hong Kong is the second richest political jurisdiction in the Far East? How come it's richer than China? All Chinese. Because the people of Hong Kong have a greater measure of liberty. How come West Germans are richer than East Germans? We destroyed them. South Koreans are richer than North Koreans. What's the common strain when you look for riches? It's limited government and free markets. That is, there are no perfectly free markets. But the way to benefit our fellow man is liberty. And limited government. The only way we can have liberty is to have limited government. See, look, folks, there's a book, and I urge you to maybe just thumb through it. It's written by a professor at the University of Hawaii. His name is Rummel. And he makes the argument very clear that government is the enemy of mankind, and we want to keep it small. He says that in this century, roughly 60 million poor souls have been killed in war. But he says that's nothing. He says that's nothing compared to the number of people who have been murdered by their own government. And most of us think that Hitler is the premier murderer. No, he is not. Stalin, I mean, Stalin and his successors are responsible for 60 million people. Mao Zedong comes in next. And then Hitler with his 16 or 17 million people. And I can give other nations as well. But it points out over and over that government is the enemy of mankind. And the framers knew this very well. If you look at Thomas Paine, he said government under the best of circumstances is a necessary evil. And that's the reason we're keeping it small, because the essence of government is coercion. And coercion is evil, in my opinion. Yeah.
We have a little bit of time. Why don't we take 2 more questions as we get.
Hi, Dr. Williams. I wanted to ask you to contrast some images. I have a picture of what you suggest of limited government as in the 3% type of thing that was in the beginning of this century, as opposed to government's power today. And I noticed that you were educated by the California state, paid for by, which is mostly funded by government. And I wanted to paint a picture of what would be the possibilities of you and all of us to be able to be here and even talk about this today if we were living in the Rockefeller years when monopoly and oil and banking industries were dominant, and where Rockefeller and his crew basically had no accountability to the workers. Would you have been able to become educated? Would I be able to become educated? Would that be possible?
Well, the problem with education in our country is that we have illiquid or imperfect capital markets. I believe that people should be able to get loans for education. Now, I got education at taxpayers' expense in California, but that doesn't mean that makes it right. And going on to Rockefeller for a second, because there's a lot of mythology about Rockefeller. Rockefeller should be your hero, particularly if you're probably an environmentalist too. Yeah. Well, but I can just recognize it. But one of the great things that Rockefeller did that environmentalists ought to applaud him. They ought to build a statue to Rockefeller, because the United States was the largest whaling nation in the world at that time, going for whale oil. And we were killing about 50,000 whales a year. And at the turn of the century, there were roughly 55,000 whales left. And it was Rockefeller that started the kerosene, the marketing of kerosene, which is far cheaper than whale oil. And so he saved the whales. Also, he saved the Galapagos turtle, because the whalers, that's what they ate. And so it had not been for Rockefeller, he didn't mean to do this, of course. All he was after was profits. But if it had not been for him, we might have fewer whales. But the point is because if I benefit from state-sponsored education, and that doesn't mean that it's right.
Well, but is your life has become more vital than it would be under the conditions of working in a factory in New York or in Boston during 1950?
I don't know. I don't know whether I would have had. We're richer as a nation, so we get more of everything. Even poor people are wealthy nowadays compared to poor people in 1800s. But next question.
Dr. Williams, in the argument of pure competition, what do you think is what would your moral judgment or justification be for the loss of jobs for the sake of a cheaper tomato?
Loss of jobs?
Yeah, if Mexico was allowed to dump the cheaper tomatoes into our country, and the Florida tomato industry lost a lot of money that way and jobs there lost, how would you justify that?
I don't think you justify it at all. That is, I think in terms of liberty, and you respond to this, I believe that I, as a human being, I ought to be able to buy tomatoes from whomever I please, whether it be a Mexican producer or an American Floridian producer. Can you give a case why I should be prohibited from buying a tomato from a Mexican producer? there is no case of morality. But surely, if I'm a Floridian producer of tomatoes, I will get all of you to lobby with me to keep Mexican tomatoes out so I can charge higher prices of mine. That's the major beneficiary of keeping American producers are the major beneficiaries of import restriction. It's kind of welfare to the rich. That's what it is. Most of the people who are in the sugar business, and they come to you and say, well, look, let's keep Caribbean sugar out and make the Caribbeans grow pot and marijuana sugar instead. What they're doing, they're forcing Americans to pay 2 or 3 times the world price of sugar. How does the ordinary citizen benefit from this? Not at all. And this is another point that Adam Smith pointed out, and I urge you to read The Wealth of Nations. He says that it's seldom that businessmen get together other than to collude against the public. Set some kind of collusion against the public, that is, keep foreign goods out. Look, folks, I've been given a deadline of 2 questions. That's it. Thank you very much.